Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Monday, the 12th of August here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Israel bolsters its defences amid a heightened risk of an attack from Iran.
Markets bet on more volatility ahead of US inflation numbers due this week.
Plus, Vladimir Putin retaliates after Ukraine's surprise cross-border attack.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Israel is bolstering its defences as it faces a heightened risk of attack from Iran or its proxies. It follows the recent assassination of the Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh, which Iran has vowed to avenge. Iran's president has accused the US and other Western nations of double standards when it comes to Israel, saying it poses a significant threat to global security. His remarks follow a deadly Israeli strike on a school in Gaza that drew international condemnation. US Vice President Kamala Harris says the death toll was high.
Far too many civilians who've been killed. I mean, Israel has a right to go after the terrorists that are Hamas. But as I have said many, many times, they also have, I believe, an important responsibility to avoid civilian casualties.
As Kamala Harris speaking there, Israel's military said the strike was aimed at a Hamas command and control centre embedded within a school and adjacent mosque. Leaders of France, Germany and the UK have issued a joint statement calling on Iran to refrain from attacks that could inflame tensions and jeopardise a ceasefire.
Now, a fire has broken out at a Russian-occupied nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine. In a post on X, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy says that Russian troops are responsible for setting the blaze. The incident follows Ukraine's shock incursion into the border region of Kursk last week, forcing Russia to evacuate more than 76,000 people from the border region. This woman was among them.
We closed the gate and rushed through the gardens. No one knew where. We ran out. Where should we go? What should we do? Went along the street and there was a boom. What should we do?
A woman evacuated from the Kursk region there, speaking via a translator. According to the Russian Ministry of Defence, 4 missiles and 35 drones over Kursk and neighbouring regions were downed overnight. Meanwhile, during his nightly address, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskiy thanked his forces for creating, quote, pressure on the aggressor.
The European Central Bank is expected to cut interest rates 6 times by the end of next year, according to a new Bloomberg survey of economists. That moves the expected rate path earlier than previous forecasts as experts adjust to sluggish economic data. Growth in the euro area's private sector ground to a halt in July, and Germany remains a dead weight for the rest of the region.
To US politics now, Vice President Kamala Harris has raised over $12 million from donors in her political home base of San Francisco on Sunday. It came after a tour of swing states, starting in Pennsylvania, where she introduced running mate Tim Walz, then going on to Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona and Nevada. According to a campaign spokesperson, Harris has now raised $310 million in the month of July. Meanwhile, the Republican vice presidential candidate floated the prospect of more than doubling the federal child tax credit to $5,000. On ABC's This Week, JD Vance sought to reframe his stance as pro-family after being attacked for referring to Democrats as childless cat ladies.
They have turned this into a policy proposal that I never made. And I do think, look, when you're a parent and you have children, you obviously have a different perspective. And I said that too, and I certainly believe that.
JD Vance there. Now, a New York Times and Siena College poll conducted last week showed Harris with 50% support among likely voters in battleground states Wisconsin, Pennsylvania and Michigan. That's compared to Trump's 46% in each state.
The UK government is proposing to double the amount of water companies pay out for bad customer service. The move is a response to public anger over illegal sewage spills and chronic leaks. Bloomberg's James Woolcock has more.
4 in 10 people are unhappy with their water supply, and those stats are from the regulator. Environment Secretary Steve Reed says the industry is broken and is increasing the minimum fee for any failure to £40. That's still only 10% of the average household bill, but the move sets the tone for difficult negotiations ahead. The industry is seeking permission to raise customer bills by more than 35% over the next 5 years, and Britain's largest company, Thames Water, faces bankruptcy and possible nationalisation. In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
Lastly, the salaries of Britain's top bosses rose to the highest levels on record, yet still lag far behind similar roles in the US. The median pay for a FTSE 100 CEO is now £4.19 million, 2% higher than last year. S&P 500 CEO pay went up by 12.5% in the same time period. The data from the High Pay Centre is likely to be a sore point for the LSE CEO Julia Hoggart and other top city bosses who say that low executive pay stops Britain from attracting top global talent. Now, in a moment, we'll bring you up to date on the events in the Middle East, plus brief you on how markets are starting the week after last week's turmoil. But another story that caught our eye after last night's Olympic closing ceremony, spectacular. The arrival, of course, of Tom Cruise on the roof of the Stade de France. Pretty amazing stuff. I watched all sorts of Olympic athletics and other events over the weekend, you know, whose rules I was desperately trying to learn or understand from the commentary.
I mean, look, it's been I think it's fair to say it's been a pretty successful Olympics for France. They've managed to pull off the hosting of it with spectacular effect and the closing ceremony, bringing that to an end. But a story from our colleague Jacob Reed caught my eye this morning about how Olympic gold medals, of course, worth their weight in metaphorical gold, but in actual gold are worth more than they ever before because the cost of or the price of gold has gone up by so much. So Jacob's been looking at what makes up the actual metals in the medals, and they're worth about $900 each. After the surge. That's the gold medals, I should say. Yeah,
well, look, I did see all of the athletes, you know, sort of pretend biting down in there, you know, to sort of show their win. I hadn't actually realised that the medals were really made of gold.
Yeah, and they all, in fact, the medals this time around also contain a small piece of the Eiffel Tower, apparently, too.
Yes,
Something one of the things. So, I mean, you probably get more money for it selling it as its value as an Olympic medal and melting it down for the constituent metals, but it's worth thinking about all that glitters when it comes to medals.
OK, let's have a think about the markets then and how they're starting this week after the wild swings last week. Things are looking calmer, and we look ahead to key data points, of course, including the US CPI reading on Wednesday. Our markets live strategist Mary Nicola joins us now for more on this. Mary, you were so helpful last week as we were navigating through the markets. How have markets returned then to relative calm today, do you think?
It seems like it this morning. So you see this morning, it seems like a beacon of solitude, especially compared to what we were seeing last week at this exact same time. It helps also that Japan's on holiday today, especially since they were one of the important sources of the market turbulence. But there's also several market events this week that's going to have and keep investors on the sidelines until we get more clarity of how to proceed and whether this volatility is actually over.
So has anything fundamentally changed in markets in the last week? We've been talking an awful lot, for example, about the unwind and the carry trade, but is there a fundamental difference to where we are this week compared to last week?
You know, not really. So if you look at it, the carry trade unwind, the main thing is that, you know, according to a lot of estimates, is that almost 3/4 of it is done. But there's still the concerns lingering about the U.S. economy and whether that soft narrative still holds. And that's an important one to allay, especially because there are still a lot of market fears that were stemming from that specifically. Obviously, we had a really strong rebound following the U.S. initial jobless claims, but that's really second, third tier data. We need, you know, something like retail sales this week, something like US CPI to really garner support for the equity markets and whether this volatility is actually over.
So tell us a bit more then about the US CPI print in particular, the inflation data. Is that a catalyst for more volatility? It does seem to be that investors a lot about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look, you know, investors are going to be looking for a U.S. inflation data that's not too hot, and activity readings from the U.S. that just aren't too cold. So a hot number is just going to evoke a more cautious stance from the Fed, and we get a number of Fed speakers this week as well, because they'll view that their job on inflation is still not done. Because remember, it's about making sure that that inflation genie not only goes back in the bottle but also stays there, and that's going to be one of their primary mandates. Even if they see that growth is slowing down, or whether they're seeing that there are cracks in the labor market. But of course, the other key part of their mandate is still going to be inflation. And so, of course, we've had a really strong rally in U.S. Treasury markets. So there's some concern, of course, especially with how Treasuries are doing, of how that unwinds, and the bias could be that we get yields push higher if, of course, the data doesn't come in as we'd like.
So apart from the US CPI print, then there's other data out this week as well that markets will be watching closely too. China, the UK as well, and we've also got a central bank decision in New Zealand. What are the other, I suppose, market stories we should be watching?
Yeah, I think the three key events, obviously besides CPI and retail sales, is going to be China's monthly barrage of data, GDP out of Japan, and then, of course, UK CPI. So let's start with China. So the activity data is going to still be highly scrutinized, of course, because concerns about how it's likely to miss its 5% growth target without more easing. So the weaker the data, the more authorities will have to do. And then second one will be Japan. Japan still remains under the limelight, especially with the BOJ shifting towards a hawkish stance. So that Q2 GDP number from Japan will validate whether the BOJ's recent hawkish tone is in fact there, and does it validate their stance, and is a reflation theme actually undergoing in Japan after all these years. And then, of course, you have UK CPI. It's another important one given BOE expectations, where markets are looking for about another 2 cuts this year. So if services and core inflation remain high, we're going to have to see a repricing of those expectations. And then finally, RBNZ. You have the OIS markets pricing in about a 66% chance of a cut at this meeting, even though the bank is looking for a pivot in Q1 2025. So there are a few key things outside of CPI and, of course, retail sales that'll drive markets.
Okay, Mary, thank you so much for being with us. Our Markets Live strategist, Mary Nicola, there with more on how we are starting this Monday, of course, in the markets. Interesting then to also think about that UK inflation data. I mean, forecasters do expect official data on Wednesday to show inflation accelerating to 2.3% in July. So a slight tick higher, bit of a hotter inflation print expected for the UK.
Let's turn to the Middle East now. Israel continuing its preparation for a potential retaliatory attack by Iran after the assassination of the Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran almost 2 weeks ago. Meanwhile, an Israeli attack on a school in Gaza has drawn international condemnation. Our EMEA News Director Rosla Matson is with us now. Ros, good morning. Starting with that attack on the school in Gaza, Israel says it was a Hamas command centre, but many countries have raised concerns about the civilian casualties involved.
Well, that's right. And this has been something that Israel has said throughout. It's very, very difficult to sort of like in a place like Gaza, you know, a small territory, people are crowded in, to work out sometimes like where Hamas is in all of that. And they've often accused Hamas of putting their fighters, putting their operatives in these places like refugee centres, schools and so on for that reason, to safeguard them from attack. And so they're saying that there was a cluster of Hamas operatives in the area, including some quite senior figures for that group, and that therefore they went in. You've got the US, though, the EU and others sort of expressing strong concern about targeting such a site given the proximity to civilians. Hamas says that 100 people or so died. That can't be verified. Israel says they suspect it was less than that. But either way, again, it just shows the difficulty in this war is that you've got Hamas is quite a nebulous organisation. You've got groups of fighters operating perhaps in tunnels underneath, civilian areas. And so how do you target Hamas without also targeting civilians as a result?
It's been almost 2 weeks since Iran and Hezbollah, though, pledged to avenge the assassinations of militant leaders in Beirut and Tehran. Have they had second thoughts?
We're kind of all wondering when it's going to happen, because they really telegraphed it's when, not if. But it has been almost 2 weeks since this event where they said they were going to have to respond, and they're still saying they're going to respond, but they haven't done anything. It might be a reflection of the fact it was like right at the brand new administration to come into Iran, so they're still trying to work out from their own end what is a calibrated response. It's possible they're also just still trying to see what happens with these ceasefire talks for the war in Gaza, because, for them, a ceasefire would be important if it's a pathway to the end of the war between Hamas and Israel. So they might want to see how those talks go this week before they respond. But they have kind of indicated they're going to respond. So at some point they have to. The question is, again, what does that response then look like?
And indeed, we've been reporting on some of the preparations underway in Israel for that potential attack as well. I mean, it's an interesting reflection on how people in Israel are preparing for this.
Well, that's right. And of course, a lot of it is about safeguarding infrastructure as well. I mean, for parts of Israel, you've got the Iron Dome missile shield, which is really important, has proved quite effective in repelling attacks both from Hezbollah and Hamas. So that's one thing that is in play. But also, safeguarding infrastructure, because Israel is an important centre for high-tech investment, for example, for startups. So you don't need the power going out for extended periods. So we know that they're bringing diesel generators even into some of these places to help keep the lights on if need be. They're also stockpiling everything from transistor radios, very old-fashioned kit to be able to communicate if needed. And so they're really girding for something again. And I guess for people living in Israel, they've been girding now for almost 2 weeks and wondering if something's going to happen.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.